Good afternoon and welcome. Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Kate Manley, the president of the Rensselaer County Regional Chamber of Commerce, and I'm so happy to welcome you all to today's webinar, very timely, planning for the return from New York State on pause, top 10 employer HR and employment law questions. So as we just heard that phase 1 in the capital region is able to open beginning tomorrow, this is a very timely topic. So we are very pleased to be joined by Deb Best, who's the owner and principal of Deb Best Practices, Joanmarie Dowling, who is the founder and member of Dowling Law, and Maggie Stephenson, who is the Senior Associate Counsel at Dowling Law. So we're excited to have them here with us. Today's webinar will consist of a presentation discussing the top 10 questions that both Deb Best Practices and Dowling Law have been most frequently asked by employers regarding the process for gradually returning employees to the workplaces and reopening businesses to the public. So today's presentation will be followed by a Q&A session. And now before we begin, I'm going to turn it over to Rachel Murray, for our events manager, to briefly introduce our presenters and do a few housekeeping items before kicking us off. So take it away, Rachel.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's nice to have you all here with us today. As Kate mentioned, and for those of you who don't know me, I'm Rachel Murray, the event manager with the Chamber, and I'm so happy to have you all here today. Before we begin, I'd like to just briefly introduce each of our presenters. So to start with, Ms. Deb Best. Deborah Best is the owner and principal of Deb Best Practices, a New York State certified women-owned business enterprise. Deb Best Practices offers a plethora of outsourced human resources, including but not limited to HR 911, HR helpline, corporate recruitment, inside hiring, HR apprenticeship and third-party employee compliant investigative services, strategic planning, change and project management, and believe me when I say so much, much more. Deb has over 30 years of senior HR practitioner experience at the state and national levels. Next, Joanmarie Dowling, Esquire. Joanmarie is the founding member of Dowling Law, PLLC, also a certified women-owned business. Dowling Law provides strategic, corporate, not-for-profit, and employment law advice and representation to organizations throughout New York State. Dowling Law also provides premier affirmative action compliance services and in-person and online workplace training solutions. Joanmarie has successfully defended employers in both federal and state courts as well as before administrative agencies. And next but not least, Maggie Stephenson, Esquire. Maggie Stephenson, also with Dowling Law, PLLC, acts as the Senior Associate Counsel. She advises and represents not-for-profit organizations and for-profit corporations on employment and other matters in the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of New York State Division of Human Rights, the New York State Department of Labor, the New York State Unemployment Board, the OFCCP, and other federal and state courts and agencies. Maggie previously worked as Assistant District Attorney at the Warren County District Attorney's Office, where she prosecuted numerous matters through the North Country. So I think it's safe to say that we are in very capable hands this morning, and I'm very excited for this program. So thank you very much to all three of you for being with us today. Our final order of business before I kick it over to these three ladies is just to go over a few housekeeping items. All attendees' audio and video will be muted and remain muted through this webinar. We will be accepting any questions that you might have exclusively through the Q&A feature located in your webinar toolbar at the bottom of your screen. If you don't see the webinar toolbar, hover your mouse at the bottom of the screen to find it. Please feel free to submit your questions throughout the presentation. All of the questions will be addressed by our panelists at the end with the Q&A session, but you can also submit questions during the presentation and we can take pause for those then. If you have any technical questions regarding audio, video, Q&A feature, etc., please use the chat feature to submit those types of questions. It's in the chat feature that will take all sorts of technical questions and logistics. Lastly, this webinar will be recorded. We will send a follow-up email with the recorded webinar link at the conclusion of today's presentation, along with today's presentation deck and the contact information for all three of our presenters. So without further ado, I will kick it over to Maggie, Deb, and Joanmarie to start the presentation. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to enter those in the Q&A feature. Thank you.
Great, and thank you. I think we're just going to be switching over to our PowerPoint. Thank you so much to Kate and Rachel and our friends at the Rensselaer Chamber for allowing us to be speaking to you today. I'm thrilled to be co-presenting with Deb and Maggie today. I have to say, I was out just a little while ago. It's the first time I've been out in a couple of days. I went to the drugstore and it was so beautiful outside. I was like, gosh, it feels like, you know, we're especially honored that you would choose to be with us. Please promise me that you'll go out later and enjoy it. It was great actually to be out because I went to the drugstore, which is probably my big outing for the week. And I was reminded about all of the different things that we're going to talk about because I came in and over the intercom, they were making announcements about social distancing and different things that they had implemented. And you could see that they had the line, and in the queue, they had the spots showing the 6 feet apart and all those sorts of things. And it was really nice to see, you know, all of that being implemented in real time. And I think probably a continuing theme of what we're going to talk about today is how do we develop a return to work plan that, you know, that is really not just on paper, but is in practicality helping to keep people safe and at work. So I'm really excited about our discussion today. And I just wanted to remind folks that this webinar is for informational purposes. So we can't provide legal advice, especially given what we're recording. Please, if you do have questions that you're going to share through the system, try to keep it at a higher level. We're certainly happy to talk to you about more specific questions that you might have involving your own personal workplace, but we can't keep this confidential in this setting. So if you have any questions or before you apply something, please, you know, consult with us, or if you have a Labor and Employment Council, consult with them. So I'm going to actually turn it over to Deb to talk about where we are to kick things off.
Thanks, Joanmarie. It also is great to be here with all of you, and thank you for taking time out of your day. I know that there's a lot of reopening information kind of flooding out there right now. You know, when we put together this presentation, we were changing it on an hourly basis based on how things change on an hourly basis. And you'll see that, you know, we're expecting to be reopened by Friday, but now it's tomorrow. So, you know, we're entering a new frontier of compliance requirements. New York is already one of the most regulated states for employers in the nation. And this is going to be a lot of work. And, you know, it's not just, are you going to be able to make sure that the lines are 6 feet apart or more, or all of those logistical things. It's, you know, are you going to be able to get your employees ready? Do they know what the rules are? Have you trained your supervisors? This is all, these are all steps that we'd like you to think about taking before you open. And we'll say it a couple of times, if you don't have to open right away, we know there are businesses that have to open, like restaurants, for example. But offices, if you're working successfully remotely, we'd like you to get ready with all this information first. There's no rush to get back unless you have an urgent client need. It is one of the most prescriptive set of compliance requirements I think any of us have seen in our careers. It is going to create a great deal more work. It's not just the initial putting together the plan and affirming that you have a plan. It's actually implementing it and sticking to it. So we want to answer your questions and give you as much information as we can, but we also want you to do it within a context of keeping yourself and your employees safe. So we're in phase one, and it's happening right now. We're, I think, the 6th region to open up, and that will be on Wednesday. And it's limited to 4 areas: manufacturing, agriculture, I don't have the list.
No.
Sorry, construction, agriculture, forestry, fishing, hunting, retail limited to curbside or in-store pickup or drop-off, manufacturing and wholesale trade. So, so we're talking about two different things. Is your region open and what phase are you in? So right now, the other 4 phases are not in play. And for a lot of the industries in phase 1, a lot of them are essential businesses. They're already open. And I think this is an important point of clarification too. Everything that businesses who have been sheltered in place have to do now, even though you're up and running, you have to do this too. You're going to be measured against the same metrics and safety plans. So it's not just for the non-essential businesses. Everyone, whether you've been running since March or you're going to open up in May, everyone is required to put this together. Next slide, please, Maggie. So as we were putting this this presentation together, one of the best ways to keep up with what's going on is listening to Governor Cuomo's briefings. They're either at 11 a.m. or 12 noon, depending on if it's a weekday or a weekend day. And very often, he's the one, he or his secretary, very capable secretary, they're giving an advanced look at what is going to come next in terms of compliance requirements. So if you can, the recordings are all over Facebook. It's really helpful to listen to those briefings, and you don't have to listen to the either end where he's chatting, but where is he announcing a new initiative? That's how I think that we can all stay up to date. So yeah, we've been monitoring him every day to make sure that this presentation was current. Next slide, please, Maggie.
Can one of the lawyers in the room just jump in with a disclaimer?
Would they?
I just want to manage some expectations. The governor did say that we are on track to open Wednesday.
Thank you. Good.
But we have not been 100% approved yet. So
I would also just say, I did see a question come through. It looked like where are libraries? And given that we were just talking, Maggie and I were talking about libraries earlier today. Maggie, do you have a response on that one?
So that's an interesting question. My mom is a library director, so I've been, conversing with her about this quite often. I was thinking that libraries would be phase 4 under education. Right. She's been in meetings where people have said that perhaps it may be phase 2. I'm not sure I see the argument for the phase 2, but to each their own. There is an interesting tool though on the website, which I found, where you can enter in your NCAIS code and your county, and it'll pop up and it'll say whether or not you're eligible at that point in time to reopen. So it's not perfect in that it can't tell you, in the future when you can or what phase you're in, but it can tell you, all right, now based on where you are geographically, yes or no, you can reopen.
You're right, Maggie. It is a great tool. I think it's also to prevent people from flooding Empire State Development, because God knows they don't have enough people to staff their phones. But it is
so true.
It is a great tool, because I think all three of us keep getting questions. Well, when am I supposed to get ready? So I think that they are, they're building. It's not a plane. It's like a hang glider. They're building the hang glider as they're flying it, and they are starting to come up to speed with these type of tools. So, it answers a lot of the questions that would prevent us from calling. So as you can see, I think we finalized the presentation an hour before we came on to the webinar, and Maggie gave me a call and said, is it going to open on May 26th? I said, no, it says trending to open on May 22nd. It says trending to open on May 22nd, because we don't know. It's really dependent on, and next slide, please, Maggie. It's dependent on our score. So as you can see, we are at 6 of 7 of the key factors for reopening. And I believe that the one factor that we're lagging in is the establishment of a contact tracing plan. So that's what's holding us back. And again, and I think the governor has been emphatic about this. we're going to continue to be measured on these metrics. And if anything falls behind, it's, the door's going to either close slightly or close completely. So we are, our businesses are rising and falling on these regional metrics. So as you can see, we're right on the cusp of it. So yeah, we're hoping that everyone can move forward in that first phase. Next slide, please, Maggie. So,
actually, I think this one's mine.
That's yours. Go right ahead.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah, I snuck this one in, so poor Deb was looking at it thinking, I don't remember this slide. It's because you haven't seen it. But I thought it'd be helpful to talk a little bit about, like, okay, what documentation, because there is so much information that's out there. Just wanted to give sort of the skeleton of what we're working with. One is the New York Forward guidelines that are out, and the New York Forward website, I think, is a helpful resource. It continues to evolve, so it's worth checking on it periodically in addition to all of the other information gathering that you're probably doing. And I would say when you are listening to the governor, it's a good heads up, but remember that just because it gets discussed in a press conference doesn't mean that it is in fact in its final iteration or final form. So be looking for more guidance, be talking to your experts that you're working with to make sure that you know what's going on. So right now we have the phase 1 requirements that are out, and they kind of fall into kind of 3 different categories that are broken down by industry. So for each of the phase 1 groups, one is they have the detailed guidelines that individuals will be required to certify. There are summary guidelines. I love the summary guidelines because they break things up in between mandatory and best practices.
I keep them right next to me.
Yes,
exactly. The Bible.
Exactly. So for those of us who don't really maybe know Dowling Law as well, we are a paperless office. Except that right now we got lots of paper. We typically print things out, but there are things that we're referring to quite a bit. It's saved us a little bit of time. But so they have the mandatory and best practices, which I think is a helpful resource, and then a safety plan template. Capital Region has also put forward Capital Region Forward guidelines. Those are helpful to look at as well. They have some information on groups that may not be captured in phase 1, like offices, right. And they have some guidelines in many respects very similar or consistent with New York Forward guidelines. So I would start off with New York, but then take a look at Capital Region and see if there's anything that's more specific. And then, of course, our standby of the OSHA guidelines on preparing workforces with COVID-19, which I think Maggie is going to talk about in a little bit more detail. Just a really helpful resource. And there may be some specific requirements for your business or industry, so make sure that you're not losing sight of those as well. So even if you are not a part of phase 1, I think it's really helpful to start looking at the guidelines. We do expect that a lot of the things that we're seeing in the requirements in terms of social distancing and cleaning and lots of different things, and we think that they're going to wind up being consistent throughout each of the phases. So it's helpful for those of us who are really trying to get a handle on where do we go to start looking at those. And I would say for office staff, very often looking at what the retail guidelines is probably closest to what you're doing. Also remember that because they're broken down by the type of work people are doing, your organization may have more than one category that you fall into. And so you're going to want to be thinking about each aspect of your business. So if, for example, you're in construction, you may have construction requirements, but when office kicks in, you'll also want to look at that. So making sure that you're planning for all of the different areas within your organization. There are certain basic components that seem to be consistent throughout the safety plans and those requirements. That includes that if you have your people working inside or working in a building or in some sort of facility, that we're looking at a reduced on-site workforce, so not bringing everybody back. and we're looking at it in the context of your space's maximum occupancy. Now, for some people, they may know what their occupancy is. For others, they may not, and you have to maybe do some checking. It might be worth talking to the organization if you don't own your building. There was a figure of one person for every 250 square feet, but I would do some digging in terms of trying to understand exactly what your occupancy is. And if you're a part of a building, then you can do that based on percentage to start to try to flesh out what that looks like. There are also protocols for managing or maintaining social distancing. So think about your entrances and exits. How is that going to work throughout the day? Where are those places within your organization, within your building, where you're going to see a lot of people? So your break room, your conference rooms, those sorts of things, maybe waiting areas. Be thinking about how you're going to social distance in those areas. So maybe you want to actually remove some of the furniture. You might want to remove the table so that people aren't congregating in the break room. I find it helpful, actually, to get a copy of your floor plan if you have one. I think visually it can be helpful to start to identify what the layout is and where people are, looking at workstations and those sorts of things, and it can be helpful to plan that out. If social distancing isn't feasible, and by social distancing we're looking at 6 feet, then individuals need to be wearing face coverings that are provided by the employer. One note that I would have is what I'm tending to see with clients is that they're saying individuals have to wear face coverings anytime they're outside of their workstation or office or speaking with someone, no matter whether it's 6 feet or not. It's a little bit easier to try to do that than to try to assess whether, in fact, we're 6 feet apart, even if we do have dots on the floor. And I like that. Anything that we can do to help people understand what we expect of them, making it easier to follow and driving that change into the organization, I think is going to be really useful. So it might be, you know, sometimes I sort of think about if I were explaining it to my mother, who's a non-attorney, you know, would she be able to understand what we were expecting? And that's what we're really looking at in any kind of safety planning. Do we have something that people will understand and know how to follow?
So, Joanmarie, wouldn't you agree that this is one of the most prescriptive set of compliance requirements we've seen in many years? I mean, there's really very little room for interpretation. You have to follow them, pretty much.
There's a whole lot on the mandatory list. So there isn't a whole lot of flexibility. I think that has advantages and disadvantages. Obviously, it's a big change for people. On the other hand, I think that it can be useful to reference when we're talking about employees coming back to the work site, to be able to say, look, here's everything that the state is requiring us to do.
Right.
And I think employees, for better or worse, will be feeling that things are substantially different. It is a lot, and what I would say is I would spend some good quality time trying to really understand what this means for your organization and how we're going to communicate that out. But it's very prescriptive. Okay, so another piece, and speaking of prescriptive, is the mandatory health screenings for employees before they begin work each day. So this is a requirement. But there is not as much description in terms of what specifically is required. They give 2 examples of things that could be done. One is taking temperatures, and the other is asking screening questions. I think the screening questions in some respects are the easier of the 2, so maybe I'll take that first. A lot of what we're looking at is questions for employees over the course of the last 14 days. Who they've had contact with, so have they had contact with someone who has been diagnosed with COVID, for example. We'd be looking at symptoms, so do they have a fever, do they have a headache, diarrhea, like other things that we would expect. And there's a whole list of questions or symptoms that you get that you'd be asking employees to report on. We're seeing people handle this in different ways. One is that they might ask employees to email or to call and answer those questions. I prefer a remote option to meeting in person, to be honest with you, because I think if we're going to be talking about doing health safety screening in person, then we have to worry about, you know, people congregating and other safety concerns. So people are doing it in different ways. I've seen people talk about doing some sort of automated process, like using Google Forms or something else. Whatever you have in terms of the information that you're gathering, you do have to show that you are doing that and reviewing those answers, those responses every day. So it's not enough to get that information and stick it in a vault without looking at it. The only thing that's worse than having somebody report the information that they're at work and they have COVID symptoms is to have somebody report that they're at work with COVID symptoms and we didn't do anything about it because we didn't look at the information. So we want to make sure that we know exactly who is going to be overseeing that process. Temperature we're going to talk about in a little while. There are pros and cons to that. But whatever it is that you're doing, you do have to have those mandatory health screenings for employees every day that they are coming into the office. There are requirements for frequent disinfection, and you actually have to keep records of what disinfecting is happening. So when it's happening, what time, what's being done. And I would say also by whom is probably a good addition, just so that we're clear. So you really need to understand that if you have a landlord, for example, who's doing disinfecting, you know, understanding when they're doing that disinfecting, how frequently they're doing it, but also thinking about throughout the day, what additional disinfecting steps do you want to take? You want to make sure that, especially with those high touch areas where people are in a lot, you know, the light switches, doorknobs, those sorts of things, that you're planning for frequent disinfection through that process. And we're going to talk a little bit more about disinfectants, but that's one key piece. And then a log of every person who may have had close contact with other individuals at the work site. This is a place where I think it's really difficult for some organizations, so I can't probably solve this problem for everybody in this webinar, but I would say, you know, for some like offices, it might be as simple as employees keeping a list throughout the day of anybody they've had close contact with, and then emailing it to a designated person or keeping it in a designated spot, so that the purpose behind this is if we have somebody in the work site who tests positive at some point, that we can then go back and identify who they might have had contact with in the period of time they were most likely to be spreading this. This actually, as cumbersome as it may feel, there actually can be an upside to keeping these records, because it helps contain, it actually discourages people too, I think, from wandering around and having too many conversations if we're having to kind of keep this additional documentation. So hopefully it helps kind of keep people maybe a little bit more contained, and using those other tools for communication like phone, email, texting or messaging, or other things that we are doing, webinars or Zoom meetings and that sort of thing. Using those alternate ways of communicating. But also it may help us in terms of not having to close the entire office, but instead send home those people who had that close contact with the person who tested positive. So it's a way of actually kind of containing if there is an issue at your work site, and perhaps allowing you guys to continue to operate, you know, with less disruption.
And Joanmarie, you, Maggie, and I were talking as we were putting this presentation together. Manufacturing organizations, especially if they're FDA regulated, OSHA regulated, distribution organizations, medical device manufacturers, healthcare organizations. They're already used to this type of culture of having to track this information. It is going to be a steeper learning curve and change management curve for businesses who have never had to do this.
I do. I mean, I think that's true. Certainly, I would say that there are some advantages for some types of offices where they have less foot traffic than some of those other places. And then for manufacturing and those sorts of things, where I tend to see questions are when spaces are really close together, it may be difficult for people to adjust from a social distancing perspective, or even just simple things like clocking in and clocking out. If there's a central, location where people are clocking in, clocking out, and so where it's possible, sometimes having a staggered start can be helpful in that regard, or exploring other creative ways of trying to keep that line moving so that you don't have a group of people kind of hanging out there. Everybody has challenges.
So one thing that I do want to know also is that you also have to keep a log of your employees' comings and goings. So for most employees, obviously your non-exempt employees who are clocking in at one location, staying there and clocking out, that's going to be easy. But I'm thinking of, for example, banks with with regional managers who may be non-exempt, so they're not tracking where they're going generally, but they are going to different branches throughout the day. You're going to want to implement some way to track that kind of movement as well.
Right. And it's important just to understand too with the exempt employees, they also have restrictions in terms of their schedules and when we can make adjustments to their salary. So we don't really spend a lot of time talking about that today, but if you have people who are still working on a part-time schedule, or you're looking at creative ways of managing through this, just be thinking about some of the wage hour compliance issues as well. Making adjustments to salary can be a challenge. So getting back to the safety plan does require that you have a plan in place for what you're going to do in the event that there is a positive case at work. So how you're going to clean and disinfect and contact trace in that case. So we'll talk a little bit more about how that, what that could look like. But you need to have that up front. And in some respects, actually, it's a little bit of a relief. Once you know what you need to do when that happens, then you don't have to, I think, be, panic stricken about what you're going to do if it does happen. Signage is actually another requirement. So they're looking for, the state is looking for you to be communicating in a variety of different ways with employees, clients, customers, vendors, anybody who might be coming on site. So looking for very visible signs that will be instructing people as to what to expect. And you may also consider things like website communication. So, things on your website or other kind of messaging that you might do. So I know like doctors' offices have been really good about sending information that says, if you're coming on site for a doctor's appointment, here's what you can expect. Here's what we expect from you. And then finally, I think all of us who have been out at all have seen those social distancing markers in retail, noting how far, what 6 feet apart looks like. So we're, those of us who weren't necessarily great about measuring distance are trying to becoming at least better at knowing what 6 feet apart looks like. But those are also a requirement as a part of some of the guidelines we're seeing now. And understand that because the office guidelines aren't out yet, we may see some changes or some subtle differences between the guidelines that we're seeing now and what ultimately would be in place for your business. But this gives you kind of a flavor for what those plans are requiring. Ultimately, what I would say in terms of the planning is just making sure that you're really trying to understand how it applies to your organization. This is not the time for check the box compliance. So, for example, in the sample plan, it might say you should have a communication plan And your plan should not say, we will have a communication plan. You need to be more detailed and understand. And we talk about a safety plan, but understand that things are going to change over time. And so we want to make sure that it's not actually a safety plan. It might be safety plans, plural, because as things continue to change, we'll continue to evolve as well.
So as Joanmarie has mentioned, each business has to develop a written safety plan for preventing the spread of COVID-19, as well as what they're going to do in the event of an outbreak. The New York State actually does have a template available. This is a screenshot of what the website looks like where you would access that. You do have to post the safety plan that you implement prominently. You have to let employees read it. You have to let it be inspected by state and local officials. You are not required to submit it to any state agency for approval, but you do have to maintain it and post it. So the template plan is actually pretty comprehensive. It addresses a lot of what we've already discussed as far as requirements. So really, they just want to make sure that not only have you read the guidelines, but you have a way to implement them, right? So it's got things from how you'll manage situations where 6 feet cannot be maintained, how you're going to get PPE and ensure that you can keep sufficient stock of it. It also has designations for specific contacts who are responsible for keeping all those logs that you're required to keep. So it really does, require some time commitment on the employer's behalf, which is why we're kind of getting out there now and, letting you know that it's out there. Even if you're a phase 4 business, I really think that this is the time where you should start working on that plan, because it's going to require not only a lot of thought process, but also time to communicate it to your employees and to get everybody trained up on, for example, those who are required to do the disinfecting or those who are required to maintain the logs. So another thing that we have alluded to a bit is that before you reopen, New York State is requiring all employers to read through that detailed guidance for their industry. It's currently 11 pages for retail trade. I mean, we're 38 minutes in, and we are still discussing just all the requirements that are part of that. So you really need to get in there and read it, because you're going to have to submit a form to the state affirming that you have read those guidelines and that you'll implement them. The form doesn't just require you to check a box like I understand. You have to put your business name, the contact, the name of the person who's submitting the form, and the contact information. Melissa DeRosa, who is the Secretary to the Government, she said in one briefing that this form is really just a way for them to be a method of holding businesses accountable, right? So if a local agency goes in for inspection and sees that you're not maintaining 6 feet or don't have social distancing markers, they're going to say, hey guys, what about this little thing that you affirmed you would follow? So it's unclear what enforcement is in place for failing to submit that form, which I think is an interesting thought, but it really is just going to be that mechanism to hold you accountable to doing all of those required procedures.
And I think probably one of the biggest concerns that we would have for our clients is that if you're not following these processes, you're not certified, you're not doing what you need to do in terms of training, that you might see an OSHA complaint or other form of claim where they're alleging that you didn't address adequately the safety concerns that were in play.
Actually, I believe on the New York Forward website and on several state agency websites, they prominently have on the front page of the website, have you been, have you not been treated well, or have you been discriminated against, or are you not safe? Call us. I believe
I haven't seen that.
Yeah, the AG's, the New York State Attorney General's office has one of those. So yeah, they they're doing their communication planning. They're implementing their communication planning. They're encouraging employees to reach out to them if they don't feel safe.
Yeah, so one thing that we really just wanted to note here is that, you know, legal compliance is important, right? But it's also important that you communicate to your employees, you know, what's in your reopening plan? What are they permitted to do? What are they not permitted to do? Their lives are going to look very different in the workplace than they did before. So it's really not about documentation only. It's about driving that new behavior with your employees. People need to know and understand what you're expecting from them. So you want to make sure that you're communicating frequently with your employees, because honestly, things are going to be changing, you know, day to day. And also, you know, consider, Joanmarie and I were talking about this earlier, you're going to get a dense document that's a safety plan, right? So maybe try to think about incorporating it into a slideshow and maybe having some sort of meeting with your employees, whether virtual or everybody 6 feet apart. But going through that document and really just trying to let them know, you know, I think of it as an employee handbook. Personally, I love employee handbooks, but not everybody gets an employee handbook and sits down with it. They just sign, yep, I got it. So for that safety plan, you know, it's so important that people know what is expected of them for this return. Like we said, you know, we could get thrown back. We could get totally closed down again easily. So just make sure you're communicating with the employees and conducting training about what's expected of them. And I would, if I were doing it, would frame it in a way of, you know, not, oh, New York State is requiring us to do all this stuff. We are committed to our employees' safety. We want our employees to return to the workplace in the most safest way possible. So that's really the kind of the frame that I would give it if I were discussing it.
So, and Maggie, just to follow up on what you just said, I alluded to this and I want to say it plainly, is that this is going to be more work. So this is not work that you can assign to somebody as an ad hoc project. This is an important part of reopening your business and conducting business on the go forward. Look at all of the acknowledgments that have to be obtained. Look at all of that information. You know, we encourage you to look at staffing and dedicating people who are primarily responsible, who are taking the lead on this. This is not like filling out a Wage Theft Prevention Act form. This is a lot more detailed. So we encourage you to plan staffing accordingly. So we're telling you to do.
We just have a quick question, sorry, about the form that you guys are mentioning.
Yep.
Is this form on the forward.newyork.gov website?
Yes. So where it is when you go on to the New York State website where it lists all the industries under phase 1, there's going to be a button that says read the detailed guidance.
Right.
And then you have to scroll to the bottom of the detailed guidance and it says click here to access the form.
And they have
gone there 1,000 times or anything.
And they have it, and it's not laid out, you know, from a communication standpoint, it is a little confusing. They actually have specified safety plans for different industries. So that is a good thing, but it's not immediately evident that they're actually doing that. So yeah, it's all over that page. So, you know, we've been talking about all these things, new things that you're going to have to do in order to reopen. And again, if you're an essential business and you've been open, you need to get this done as quickly as possible. So they haven't, as Maggie and Joanmarie have mentioned, there is a specific deadline right now. They are saying as soon as possible. So taking a step back, should you bring everybody back all at once? And, you know, as we said in a previous slide, this has been a real paradigm shift for a lot of companies. And I'm just referring to, you know, professional services companies who have been able to 100% work from home, where they never thought they could. So if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Keep the employees safe. Do this at a pace where, you know, you can get all this work done, these plans, implement them, communicate them. I have several essential business employers who, now that their region is reopened, hey, let's bring all the people back who are working remotely, who have been just fine and productive working remotely. That's probably not the wisest thing to do, but that's entirely up to you, ultimately. It is the decision. We give our best advice. It's ultimately the decision of the employer. But, you know, to be able to tap the brakes on certain groups of employees, or even in some cases, your entire business, I think particularly complicating, again, is that if you don't own your own building and you have to work with your landlord to ensure compliance to your safety plan, and if they're not able to help you out with that, that you have to, you know, as Joanmarie said, you have to arrange for extra disinfecting, for example. That, you know, these are things to think about. And I know of another company where the owner said they would never, ever work remotely. And they are having, I think that he's been telling us that they've been having their best year 100% remote. So these are some data points to consider. This is a real paradigm shift. So, you know, for those supervisors who are traditionally command and control and they want to see people in front of them, that may not be the best strategy. So we'd like you to think about, should you bring everybody back all at once, or do you want this to be in a more phased process? And again, for businesses like restaurants and you know, public facing employers, that's not always an option. But for those who can, we'd like you to think about tapping the brakes a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So I just have a quick bone to pick with our lovely governor.
Would you?
So we've seen Governor Cuomo talk about Matilda's Law quite often. I can't say law, Matilda's Law. It's really a nice sentiment for him to name something after his dear mother. But it's not a law. He can do a lot of things in a state of emergency. One thing he cannot do is unilaterally enact law. I digress. When you're looking at bringing people back and choosing which employees are coming back, remember that age and disability status are protected traits in New York State. So we really want to make sure that we're not saying, all right, everybody's coming back except for you people over 70 and you immunosuppressed people. I have to say it because he keeps talking about this and he's driving me a little batty. So instead, work with your employees reasonably on an individual basis. Use legitimate, non-discriminatory reasons when you're choosing who's coming back. Obviously, if somebody says, hey, I'm immunocompromised, I've been 100% working from home perfectly, can I stay home? Consider that on an individual basis. That, you know, likely will be treated as an accommodation request, right? If you want to go that route. But it's a case-specific manner. Let's please not put a blanket law or not put a blanket rule into effect that if you're over 70 and you're immunocompromised, you can't come back to work.
And we've had actual questions. I mean, I've had clients call me and say, okay, we're putting our plan together. So these people over 65 and these people who are immunocompromised, they're not coming back, and they can't work from home. And we're like, I don't think so. No, we don't want you to get in trouble. Right.
Scary.
Yeah. I was going to say, you know, one of the questions we've gotten though is like, what do we do if we think that somebody maybe doesn't want to come back or shouldn't come back? Mm-hmm. You know, ultimately the determination about bringing somebody back, if they have a medical condition that qualifies as a disability that may pose a threat to themselves or others if they come back to work, you know, really what we're looking at is, do they pose that direct threat? Typically in this case, the risk would be to themselves, because if they are sick, we're just not going to let them come back to work. So how do we deal with that? And one of the things that I think probably is maybe among the more helpful things is to be communicating with employees and be doing it early. So when you're talking to them about safety, I mean, be reaching out and saying, hey, we're developing a safety plan. There are going to be a number of different things. We're going to have training on it. We're going to talk to people about what that looks like before we get back to the office or before we get back to the work site, assuming that you're not already there. And so we wanted to let you know we're going through this planning. We're going to be in touch with you periodically about it. As we are planning, is there anything that you need for us to know about your situation? And then that gives us an opportunity for somebody to say, I have a condition myself, or because of my age, I have concern, or I have a family member who, or I have a child who's not in school or not in daycare due to COVID. And there are accommodation requirements that we have for individuals with known disabilities. There are leaves that may be available to people because they or a family member have been told by a healthcare provider to stay home due to their health condition and because of COVID, or maybe they're, they are entitled to leave because their child is not in school or daycare because of COVID. It helps us to kind of identify who's out there, who wants to come back, who maybe is not, ready to come back yet or doesn't think that they're ready to come back, and who's just scared and may need more communication, more hand-holding, more, flexibility. And then that helps you with your plan, because then you can take all that information and you don't have to know every leave law, every accommodation requirement. You can just kind of start to bucket people together, and then you can call your attorneys or look for additional resources to understand, all right, what do we do with this category of folks?
And Joanmarie just gave everybody a great tool in terms of starting that conversation rather than the paternalistic, well, you have this problem, you're not coming back. So that's a great gift Joanmarie just gave you.
Oh, thank you. I liked it.
I just want to interrupt really quick and say, I know that we have a ton of content to cover, but I just want to remind us of the time. So if there's any highlights that we really want to make sure we touch on, and just leave a couple minutes at the end.
We will. Questions. Absolutely. Yep. So employee temperatures. Every organization has to make that decision for themselves, but I think that there are some concerns about making sure that if you are taking temperatures, that you're doing it right with people who are trained to do it, trying to avoid as much as possible that the direct contacts that would come if you're using a traditional mouth thermometer, as the gentleman here is using. I know a lot of people are looking at the potential of doing the thermometers that are the remote no contact, but those are hard to come by. So I would say definitely in terms of health checks, asking the questions about symptoms, who they've been in contact with, who's had COVID, or whether they've had that contact, those sorts of things. If you are going to be taking temperatures, try to have no contact temperature taking. Consider outsourcing it to a company that has trained people to do it, or make sure that your folks are trained and that they know that the information has to be confidential. With healthcare provider certifications, I would say, just make sure that if you have somebody who is out because they have COVID-like symptoms, I'm still old school and say I really want the healthcare provider to be releasing them to return back to work. We have not yet seen people being unable to get those provider certifications. We haven't seen the overwhelm that folks have said. So from my perspective, I would err on the side of safety and have someone officially making that determination.
So let's talk about unemployment insurance for a couple of minutes here. We are also in an extraordinary time period where we've never seen unemployment insurance benefits like this. And, I think that a couple of other things we want to underscore from a best practices standpoint is that everything should be an authentic, compassionate discussion. I mean, I've had some employers call me frustrated saying they're scared to come to work, I'm going to fire them. It's like, no, then they're going to go to that Attorney General's website. And also it impacts your reputation negatively because people are going to remember how employees were treated, not only currently, but after this is all over. So this is about an iterative discussion. And frankly, until New York Forward came out, I was having discussions with employers saying, well, they're saying that they don't feel safe, and these were essential employers. Are they wearing masks in the building? Are you maintaining 6 feet apart? And I think this really is a great tool now. So if employees are saying, I don't feel safe, you can say, here's the plan, and we're going to stick to it, and we need your help. But a black and white, yeah, let them go on unemployment, that's not the right way to go. However, there are a number of companies, because of their industries, let's say restaurants, for example, they've had to furlough employees. And I've had a lot of questions from clients, well, how is this affecting my unemployment insurance rating? Actually, I just was doing a little research right before the presentation, and since a chunk of this money is federal funds, some of it will not affect your insurance rating, but some of it will. But, you know, in terms of economies of scale, it's going to be less dollars ultimately to the bottom line. But, you know, compassion and discussion is the rule of the day when looking at, I'm scared to come to work. So we've talked about this already. If you've been to the grocery store, you've been to the drugstore, it's going to be the same situation in your office. And, again, distribution centers and manufacturing companies, they already know how to do this. They have the safety lines drawn on their manufacturing floors. They understand all this. Those of us who have only worked in offices, this is going to be strange. So it's really important to get up to speed and to get your workspace retrofitted. And again, offices usually don't have staggered shifts. These facilities do. You may have to shift your paradigm and look at either different people working on different days or staggering their shifts on the same day, and certainly modifying those common areas. No buffet lunches, no coffee pots, no nothing no water coolers, nothing that is going to be communal that's going to be touched. But you can still provide bottles of water and box lunches if you want to treat your employees to lunch.
So for disinfectants, I think the big piece is understanding what needs to get done and who's going to do it. So if you have a landlord who's doing disinfecting, understand what they're doing, what products they're using, be informed there, and then be planning for that throughout the day, including in those high-touch areas. Make sure that the disinfectant is EPA and DEC approved. There's a list so you can actually see. And if you look at the back of the disinfectant, they'll actually have the number. You can, in each of those websites, put the number in and just confirm that it's approved. And then people need to know exactly how to follow the directions to do it, and then maintain those logs that show this is when we were in disinfecting, this is what happened, and when, and as I said, I think also by whom, so that we know who's actually doing it. Again, this is a place where the floor plan can be helpful so you can identify those high touch areas. I think we probably just want to hit the PPE. I know we're getting close to time.
That's okay. I was actually just going to address the group and say that there is obviously a lot of content to cover right now. So if you guys are okay as the presenters to just run a few minutes over, and then we can leave the attendees, it's up to them if they would like to stay on or drop out. But once again, just to remind everyone, I will follow up with contact information in case you do have to drop out and you'd like to follow up with any specific questions. So you guys feel free to keep on going.
Great. And the PowerPoint will be available and the recording as well?
Yes, that will all be in the follow-up email.
Great. Thank you.
Great. So I think one thing that we haven't addressed that's on this slide is the hand hygiene stations. You are required by New York State, and that's really why, at the beginning of our presentation got so wieldy, is because, all of those requirements came out. So the hand hygiene stations is something that you're required to provide to your employees. That means that basically you need to provide them with soap, water, and paper towels. They're very specific that you can't be sharing towels to dry your hands. Or where that's not feasible in a work site, alcohol-based hand sanitizer. So I did want to discuss here just the PPE, because a lot of people are saying, all right, well, you know, I'm ready to get my employees back. Do I have to give everybody an N95 mask? So remember, in New York State, we have the current rule in effect that all employees must be provided with at least a face covering. So that's really going to be our baseline. Everybody has to be provided with that. It has to be cleaned. You know, so that's kind of the baseline. From there, it's an individualized assessment based on the specific employee's risk level. And it's not only based on their position, but it's also what they're doing in the position. So anybody who really wants to really dive into this, this is all based on the OSHA recommendations. So OSHA has identified 4 exposure risk categories: very high, high, medium, and low. So very high is people who are working with aerosolized COVID-19 particles. So these are healthcare workers that are performing, for instance, intubations on people who are either known or suspected of having COVID-19, morgue workers who are you know, performing autopsies that will provide an aerosol generating procedure. So really that's those people. Very high, you're working with known or suspected COVID-19 aerosolized, right? High is people who are working with known or suspected sources of COVID-19, but they're not aerosolized. So this is your nurse who may be working with the COVID-19 patients in their room, bringing people who are bringing them food, things like that. And then medium exposure is you're required to have frequent contact with the general public, right? So it's not that, okay, you know, I'm working on the COVID-19 unit. It's I'm working with the general public. Maybe you're the receptionist at the doctor's office, and you know, you're screening people, so you don't really think that anybody with COVID-19 is coming into the office, but you're still in contact with the general public. And then your lower exposure risk are, you know, your office workers, right? Who I can easily go to the office and sit in my office by myself. That's your low risk. So what are you required to provide those people? Well, likely if they're high or very high risk, there's going to be some combination of gloves, a face shield, goggles, a gown. Gowns need to be large enough so that they're covering areas that require protection. So you can't just, you know, have a tiny little gown, say, oh, we're only using half of gowns for now. That seems silly. Those who work closely with people who are either known or suspected to have been infected with COVID-19, they should wear respirators. It's not a requirement by OSHA because those respirators are in such high demand, but it is a should. You know, so really it's just going to be trying to develop that combination of PPE that would be most protective based on the risk level that the person is in. You know, they say that if you're in a medium exposure, you might need to have a combination of gloves, a gown, and a face mask, depending on your job duty. And low risk people don't have to be provided with anything additional. Just remember that your New York State baseline of your face covering is there. So again, if you want to dive into that more, obviously we'd be happy to talk to you about it, but that is all in the OSHA guidance for COVID-19 workplaces.
So I think that actually that, you know, Maggie just made a point that I want to remind everybody about or reinforce, and that is very often what we're looking for is you look at all of the varying resources for guidance for your work site, and then you're applying typically the highest standard. So if New York requires just a cloth covering, but you're working in a higher risk organization and OSHA is requiring something more substantial, then obviously the more substantial rules are going to apply. So what happens if we have an employee who refuses to wear PPE in the work site? Well, typically, the requirement is there, the employer can require it, but also New York would typically require it. But there are or could be exceptions for somebody who couldn't, for example, safely wear face coverings. And so in that case, I think the first piece that we would be trying to do is understand where that's coming from. If there's a medical or other reason why the individual can't wear the PPE. If we're looking at a formal legal accommodation process, we might actually be looking for documentation to substantiate that. And then we may be looking at, as in all accommodation situations, what are our various options? So if somebody can't wear PPE in the workplace, should we have them working remotely? Or could we move them to a workspace where they have less contact with people than where they would normally be working? And maybe there's a different assignment that would be available to them where they can work in a space that has different ventilation. So we'd be looking at all of the various options, understanding that, we do still have undue hardship as a defense in the event that, we can't accommodate that request. We may be looking at undue hardship in that case, or putting the individual on the leave of absence if that's a possibility.
You know what, Joanmarie, we were also talking about, in our experience, a lot of the time they just want to complain. They just want to say, I don't want to wear the damn mask. And they want to talk to you about it. And, have these conversations sometimes on an hourly basis. And yeah, I don't want to wear a mask all the time either, but we have to. I understand. I think it's about just hearing them out a lot of the time, is that they just want to be able to say, this sucks. Don't you agree? Yes, it does, but we got to do it anyway. So that's the employee relations piece. And then if you have someone who is blatantly just saying, no, I'm not going to do it, and endangering employees. Well, first of all, the quickest thing you can do is send them home for the day and decide what you're going to do for them, because your ultimate goal is to keep everybody safe, including that employee who doesn't want to wear a mask. And then you have, that last straw option of progressive counseling. But we want to treat this on a human case-by-case basis to see really what need is not getting met that they're trying to tell us about, because they usually are upset and they're not very clear.
And I think that just kind of goes back to what we were saying before is, bring it back to that baseline of we're trying to make it safe for you.
Right.
If you frame it that, it's for you, it's in your best interest, we're concerned about you, sometimes that'll get you somewhere.
Yeah. And if not, sometimes we can go back to sort of like, here's what the state's told us we have to do to be working.
That's right.
Yeah.
So there are varying strategies depending on who it is. And, I think that's why kind of understanding what it is, whether it's medical, religious, philosophical, or just grumpiness, whatever it is, that we understand it, and then we can look at the different ways of explaining why we're doing what we're doing. Good. Okay, so what happens if someone tests positive for COVID-19? First, remember that your safety plan is going to require that you have a plan for cleaning, disinfecting, and contact tracing. In that circumstance, one of the first calls that we're going to be making is to the local county Department of Health to let them know that we've heard that report. The clients, fortunately we haven't had too many, but we've had some who have gone through this process, and it's generally been a positive one in terms of the support that they got from the county to be able to explain this is what our plan is in terms of cleaning. The Department of Health will be looking to understand who that person had contact with. So if you've been keeping up on making sure that employees are documenting who they've had contact with, that's certainly going to be helpful. and is going to expedite the process. And I think one of the things that'll be really helpful is, you're going to have to be making communications with employees about the fact that they may have been exposed or there may have been a workplace exposure to COVID. But ADA and New York Human Rights Law aren't going to allow you to tell them who it was, because confidentiality rules don't allow that. So that can create a lot of anxiety. But this is where actually having all of your plan in place can be useful. One is you're going to talk about the fact that you're partnering with the County Department of Health, so that you're working with them to help assess where exposure might have happened. Make sure that the people who need to know are in touch and are doing the things that they need to do to stop this in its tracks. You're also going to be able to talk about what your cleaning process and disinfecting processes are. So there are different strategies. For example, if you can just kind of close the door on where that person was for 24 hours and then do a clean from there, that tends to be the preferred method, is to close that off. And it means that you wouldn't necessarily have to close your entire facility. If you know where that person has been, then you can kind of isolate that particular place. And then employees who have been in close contact are going to be hearing from the Department of Health or the contact tracers, and they're going to walk through what additional steps that they want those individuals to take, whether it's a precautionary quarantine or testing or both. They will help us to identify who those people are. We'll work in partnership with them. So it actually can be something that we can address very proactively, but it's helpful to know exactly what you're going to do. For example, if you're going to have somebody come in and do a deep clean from the outside, identifying those vendors and having that relationship already so that you're ready to go if and when that happens can be useful. And if you're going to do it in-house, understanding exactly who and how that process is going to work is going to make this a lot easier for you in the event that you have to deal with this. And then you can really then be more focused on managing the employee and the community relations.
So we talked a little bit about this, and let's reiterate it again. What if the employer refuses to either perform the essential duties of their job, or they don't even want to report to work? It's always on a case by case. Do you have your plan in place? Have you told the employee, several times? Because these are very complex new concepts that we're introducing. I don't know about you, I'm sitting on 3 to 5 webinars a day because this is so complex, and you have to do a number of repetitions before people understand it. So like any other safety hazard, assess the complaint, see if there actually are safety gaps, and see if there's anything that's within your control to address, whether it's addressing the physical workspace, the work the employee is going to do. Can you find leaves and other accommodations? Can the employee work from home? These are all tools in the toolkit before, before all these leaves and everything was available. When we started sheltering in place in mid-March, we didn't have any tools, basically. People were frantic. And frankly, I know that we've all experienced that employees just want to go out on furlough and get that extra $600 a week, but that only lasts until the end of July. So we really want to have an iterative process on the lack of willingness to come back, either because they don't feel safe or, and it's a challenge. Some of them are making more money out on unemployment right now than they did on their jobs. So it's a real back and forth. And, that's when, hopefully we've given you some nuggets to take away, and we're all here, all 3 of us, to help support you on these case-by-case situations, because unlike the New York Forward requirements, humans are not rigid in black and white. They're very gray. And we want you to, help maintain morale throughout this, help maintain your external reputation, and, and stay in compliance with all employment-related laws. So speaking of employment-related laws, we can go please to the next slide. It's a bonus question. So we're getting a lot of, I get at least one question a day on what do I need to do so I get my PPP loan forgiven, because it's related to making sure that you have the same amount of full-time equivalents on payroll by June 30th, and you have to spend 75% of the loan on payroll costs to convert that loan into a forgiven grant that you don't have to pay back. So, and then if you could just go to the next slide, because then I want to give people a chance to ask some questions. I don't want to go through the calculation on this. I'm an English major, not an accountant. But this is how I was taught 31 years ago how to calculate FTEs. People are really getting caught up in, I don't have the same people in these jobs. You don't need to have the same people in the jobs. It's just the same equivalent FTEs. And the Department of the Treasury has also clarified that if you have an employee who doesn't want to come back to work, that they won't hold it against you in the forgiveness of your loan. So there are a couple of other nuggets there where, yeah, and you're balancing a lot of stuff. And those of us who were lucky enough to get the PPP loan, we want to get that converted to a grant, but we want to do that in a way that's balancing all of these needs. And I think we're ready for Q&A, unless Maggie and Joanmarie want to jump in.
No, I think a big portion of it is, if we could have one key takeaway, there's so many things that are kind of interlocking here. Yeah. So we've got our federal obligations, we've got our New York State obligations. All of a sudden now the capital region is saying, oh, here's what we're recommending. So really it comes down to just figuring out, what's your baseline, and then how do we want to manage it for our particular workplace? And how are we going to make our employees feel safe and comfortable returning?
Very good. Well, we do have, we'll linger for a couple of minutes to see if anybody has some follow-up questions that might come in now that we've concluded the presentation. There are just a few outstanding questions in the Q&A chat box if you guys want to take a look at them. They were referring back to some of the initial comments made at the beginning. We can go from there.
Yeah, so I'll take the first one. So we have a question from Hope. Hi, Hope. You may get to this, but are there similar guidelines for the process for customers that come onto your work site? And the answer is yes, although not as directly for employees. You see this often in the context of retail. So they're talking about doing, as much contactless drop off or pickup of product as possible. There is some suggestion in terms of asking individuals who are coming into the work site similar questions to the questions that you would be asking for employees. I think that's a good practice for those folks who don't have people coming in on a regular basis, or people who are working in a field where we'd expect that individuals might have COVID or COVID-like symptoms. It is not required for retail in the same way, so don't expect that in Lowe's that they're going to be stopping people as they come in and going through a questionnaire and taking temperatures before people come in. But part of the signage would say, might say, if you're exhibiting any of these kinds of symptoms, please don't come. So there are, I think, a variety of different strategies that you could use to address the third parties coming into the work site. And then we have another question from an anonymous. If your workspace or office is leased does the building owner have a responsibility to tenants to clean and disinfect the ventilation system and common access areas with shared tenants? So I have not seen anything specific to building owners very often. This would be driven by the lease.
Right.
And what the lease says. I know that there are building owners who are looking to try to address these. We're actually moving into new space. I know that our new landlord has been working on protocols and communicating those protocols to tenants. I think as an employer and as a tenant, you would have a responsibility ultimately for ensuring the safety of your people and making sure that disinfecting is happening. So I think the appropriate thing to do is to be asking those questions affirmatively of the building owner to make sure that you understand what they're doing, and then if they are not doing those things that need to happen, either negotiating for them to do those things or making arrangements independently to do that. So for your own area, it's probably a bit easier to manage that, because if they do their cleaning but they're not disinfecting, then you let them do the cleaning and then you arrange for the disinfecting piece. For shared spaces, that may be a little bit more difficult and require a little bit more negotiation, but hopefully the guidance that you're getting from New York State would help in terms of negotiating and coming to common ground on that.
I'll take the next one. Unfortunately, no, there has not been any funding announced unless Governor Cuomo, while we did this webinar, announced funding. To the contrary, the state and the state is facing anywhere from a $16 billion and up budget gap right now because of the pandemic. So at this time, we have not heard of any funding to pay for all of this. And as we said at the beginning of the webinar, it's more work and it's going to be more overhead on your part to fulfill the compliance requirements. But if we do hear of anything, we'll let you know as soon as we can.
And I think the last one is a PPE comment. Maggie, I don't know if you want to take that one.
Yeah, so Elaine referencing that I think she was talking about when we were discussing what to do when an employee refuses to wear PPE. And it is a good point that I don't think we made, which is that because the PPE requirements are going to be incorporated into your policies, their refusal to wear that PPE would be a violation of policy. So that is certainly something that you could use as a point. And also, if you were going to engage in that progressive discipline, we would certainly want to make a note of their violation of company policy. A great point.
Just understanding that if it relates to a medical condition, for example, that qualifies as a disability, we may need to consider an adjustment of a work rule prospectively.
Correct. Yeah.
Can't do that. So in that case, we would just want to make sure that there's no exception that might apply. But yeah.
Yeah. No medical reason.
That's why it's important always to ask why first. You ask questions first. And then take action after that.
Very good. Well, at this time, if no one has any further questions, we don't have anything else lingering in the Q&A feature. So I think at this point then, that does conclude our formal portion of today's webinar. Thank you everyone for sticking in with us, and thank you Maggie, Deb, and Joanmarie for both your time today and your expertise on the topic. And then of course for extending your time as well to make sure that we covered everything. So we really appreciate it. And as a reminder to everyone, as I had mentioned at the beginning of today's webinar, a follow-up email will be coming out after the conclusion of today's webinar that will include today's presentation deck, the recording of the webinar, any links or resources that were referred to during today's presentation, and then of course contact information for our three lovely presenters today. So thank you all for being with us today. And again, one final thank you to Maggie, Deb, and Joanmarie. We really couldn't say thank you enough. So thank you very much. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their afternoon. And we look forward to seeing you soon.
Take care.
Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you. Bye.